When it comes to requests for episodes of Game Over, Mega Man is always close to the top. I mean, we've done more than 60 episodes of this series and have yet to tackle any of the Blue Bomber's adventures. Well, that's about to change, because this episode is dedicated to the long-running franchise's very best endings. No, I'm not talking about Mega Man 2 or 3 or even 4, you weirdo, because we're going to the arcade to check in with Capcom's Power series. So turn back now if you don't want to know what happens next, because today we're going to spoil the stories and endings for both Mega Man the Power Battle and Mega Man 2 the Power Fighters. This is Game Over, the early years. If you haven't played Mega Man the Power Battle, or simply forgot that it even existed, then I don't blame you. It came out in 1995 and was stuffed between Mega Man 7 and 8, which was around the time the franchise's popularity was starting to wind down. The lone console port at the time was Rockman Battle and Fighters on the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and sadly, that never made its way outside of the US. If you remember it at all, it's probably because of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox compilation. Now, despite not being one of Mega Man's A-list games, the Power Battle has a surprisingly great ending. Actually, it has 3 of them. You see, this is a fighting game where you choose to play either as Mega Man, Proto Man, or Bass, and then you fight through about a half dozen one-on-one fights against Dr. Wily's most famous robots. It's basically a Mega Man game that strips out all that side-scrolling platforming stuff and only focuses on the boss fights. And even then, these battles aren't as intense and exciting as their 8-bit counterparts. Even the story feels like a retread. Dr. Wily is once again up to no good and has revived 18 of his favorite creations. There's no grand plan or major development to the story, it's just an excuse to revisit some of the most beloved levels from the first 7 Mega Man games. Even more disappointing is that the story remains the same regardless of whether you pick the bosses from Mega Man 1 and 2, the bosses from Mega Man 3 through 6, or the bosses from Mega Man 7. All 3 characters have different reasons for going up against Dr. Wily, all of which is explained in their endings. And since that's what you're here for, let's go ahead and skip straight to the end, where we need to go up against Wily and his constantly changing ship. Once you've knocked him out of his protective armor, it's time to shoot him down and win the day. This is what happens when you beat the game with Mega Man. Now this is what happens when you beat the game with Proto Man. And finally, here is what happens when you get to the very end and beat the game with bass. One year after testing the waters with the Power Battle, Mega Man returned in a brand new arcade sequel called The Power Fighters. This took the idea of the first game and added to the formula in some noteworthy ways. Now there are 3 separate stories with different bosses to fight, more characters to choose from, and best of all, a pretty cool 2-player co-op mode. The story sees Dr. Wily attacking Dr. Light's lab and stealing crucial parts for robots. And if that wasn't bad enough, he's also taken Roll as a hostage. Now it's up to Mega Man, Proto Man, Bass, and a new robot named Duo to either race after Wily, focus on saving Roll, or try to get Light's tech back. These different paths will pit you against different bosses, but the stories all play out the same way. Now, this is where things get complicated. Because you can play this solo and teamed up with a friend, Mega Man 2 The Power Fighters has 10 different endings. Some of them cover different ground, but I'm gonna warn you that there's a fair amount of repetition in some of these combinations. Let's focus on each of them, starting with Mega Man. He defeats Dr. Wily, and this is what happens next. Alright, let's rewind a bit and see what happens when you beat the game with Proto Man. Now let's see what happens when you beat the game with bass. And finally, here's the conclusion of Duo's story. Okay, now that we've seen all the solo endings, let's focus on the team-ups. Here's a super cut of all 6 of the co-op endings, starting with Mega Man and Proto Man. Yeah, there's some repetition here, but I like these endings. Capcom always goes all out when it comes to their endings, and I like how much story they cram into these 13 cinemas. I mean, we see the battle from different perspectives, learn more about Duo, and even see hints at what Wily's coming up with next. This long-haired mystery robot right here is a fun nod to Zero, who you may remember being introduced just a few years earlier in Mega Man X on the Super NES. And that's not the only nod to X, because Light also talks about improving the AI so the robots will be able to discern the differences between right and wrong all by themselves. The amount of story they fit into these endings is a nice touch, but it's also a little annoying. They had all this to say, yet couldn't come up with better evil plots for Dr. Wily. There's basically no story to the first game, and the second game pales in comparison to the earliest 8-bit outings. I mean, I get that this is an arcade game and nobody's playing it for the story, but it's not hard to imagine these endings having a lot more impact with a better setup. I love Mega Man, but the endings are the best part of these two arcade games. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, the early years. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite Mega Man game? Yeah, I'm expecting to see a whole bunch of votes for 2 and 3. But who knows? Maybe some of you will surprise me. I mean, I'm sure Mega Man X has some fans, right? Anyway, let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back tomorrow with a review of summer sports games, followed by a fun feature where we decide which country has the best Genesis covers. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,